The UK economy is in serious trouble. What you need to know. The UK economy is one of the largest economies in the world today and was undoubtedly the single country with the greatest influence in bringing the world into the modern era as a precursor to the Industrial Revolution. This makes the economic problems that we are about to explore even harder to accept, because the decline of the UK economy, as well as the social, political, and financial problems that result from it, do not necessarily have to happen. When an economy is doing well, it is easy to continue to do well. Its currency will be strong, people will want to invest in it, it will be able to obtain loans at low interest rates, and should favor political stability, which means that economic plans can be made over decades and generations rather than in quick election cycles. If you appreciate the video you watch and want to help us continue creating interesting content, we kindly ask you to consider the idea of subscribing to our channel and leaving us a donation to support us. Thanks to your support, we will be able to continue improving and offering you new insights. You can do it here below, through the appropriate buttons, subscribe, and thanks. When an economy is stagnant or even getting worse, its currency becomes less attractive, obtaining loans becomes more difficult, people will avoid investing in it, and political decisions will be made by whoever can make the biggest promises to voters who want to get out of the economic chaos. It is easy to see what kind of situation the UK is in today. The country is no longer globally influential as it once was, and its economy is increasingly focusing on a few sectors that do not do much good for the average American. The economy that led the Industrial Revolution and kicked off the greatest economic boom in the history of humanity is today struggling with very real problems such as poverty and drastic regional inequality. The biggest problem, however, is that it may not even matter the real economic situation of the UK, if not even underestimated. And that is because the country is rapidly turning into a two-speed economy with extreme wealth concentrated in London and economic decline everywhere else. The two halves on average balance each other out, but really the standard of living of most participants in the UK is getting worse. If policymakers do not feel any pressure to reverse this trend, then it will probably continue, which will be great for everyone who is lucky enough to be employed in London's global sectors, but at the expense of everyone else in the country. It is, if nothing else, a truly interesting case study on what defines economic success today. So, why, despite centuries of dominance, is the UK losing ground? Has London's growth come at the expense of the rest of the country? And finally, will it be possible to reverse these problems now that they have taken hold? Managing a country's economy and managing personal finances are very different propositions. A country can go into massive debt to finance investments in public services, and as long as it can grow the economy as a whole, it is considered a good investment. But for people, it is necessary to be careful about where they spend their money, and that is why we are partnering with Trading 212, an investment platform that helps you invest your money more intelligently and commission-free. My favorite feature is the pies. You can choose which companies you want as slices in your personal investment pie and automatically assign a set amount of your funds even outside of normal market hours. It's great for dollar cost averaging if you're not sure which stocks to choose. You can see what other investors have in their pies and copy it. Even if I live in Australia, I get paid in euros, and Trading 212 allows me to have accounts in multiple currencies so I don't have to move money and incur annoying currency exchange costs. If I ever need to move currencies, the exchange rate is the same that banks charge each other, and the fees are never more than 0.15%. If you're like me and tend to forget to regularly deposit money, you can also completely automate this process and have regular deposits go into your savings account. Just for our audience, if you use the code E after registering and making a deposit on the platform, you will receive a free share worth up to $100. Check out the link in the description or use the code E to invest better right away. This month alone we have explored the economies of America and Greece, two other European economies that have been stagnant since the mid-2000s, and it is important to make a big clarification. The UK is not in as serious a situation as these countries, not yet at least. But the challenges the UK faces are different, and while potentially less serious, they will be more difficult to manage. The biggest problem is simply a crisis of confidence. There is a reason we always include something potentially ambiguous like confidence in our exploration of all national economies, and even if we include it in our ranking. It is because it is one of the most important things any economy can build, and once it is lost, it can cause very tangible damage. The UK economy has obviously had a long and slow decline from its peak as the dominant colonial power in the world, but its economic problems, as they exist today, began on September 16, 1992, now affectionately known as Black Wednesday. Before this, the UK still had its problems, but it was still seen as one of the most stable and reliable economies in the world for trade, finance, and investment. The pound was still the second most used currency globally and had a reputation for being, well, solid as a pound. Older people may remember this saying, but today it doesn't make much sense anymore. 2 years before this fateful day, the UK entered into an agreement known as the European Monetary System, or ERM. This agreement was almost a precursor to the euro. What this agreement did was link the major European currencies together with a pre-agreed band of exchange rate fluctuations. If the exchange rate between two member countries became too high or too low, the central banks of those two countries would have had to intervene to bring it back within the agreed band. This was a very expensive process and meant that the central banks of all the countries involved had to hold large reserves of all the other currencies of the participating countries to ensure that they could buy or sell any currency that was necessary to keep their own currency within an agreed price. In theory, all of this was not as stupid as it sounded. By controlling exchange rate fluctuations between countries, it would be much easier for businesses to trade and invest across borders without taking on exchange risk. If a French company invested in an American business and then it doubled in value, that would be great, but if at the same time the American dollar lost value, the French company would be back to square one. The exchange rate mechanism made it so that this theoretically could not happen, which provided a big boost to trade interactions between the major European economies. In reality, the UK did not sign up to this scheme when it was first introduced by the European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union, in 1979. It took 11 years for the UK to join the agreement after political tensions within the country put into question the benefits and risks of indirectly anchoring their much more globally dominant currency to the rest of Europe. 1990 was not the ideal time to get on board with the ERM because it coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reunification of East and West Germany, which may seem completely unrelated, but let us explain. East Germany, which was a satellite state of the USSR, was much less economically developed than West Germany, and the new unified Germany had to find a way to bring millions of people out of absolute poverty, modernize massively outdated industries, and build connecting infrastructure without destroying the existing economy in the West, which in comparison was doing quite well. The reason why this was important for the UK is that Germany decided that the best way to do this would be to raise interest rates so that foreign investors would be tempted to put money into Germany, where they could get a good return, and then Germany could take part of this money and use it to make the necessary investments to bring the East up to speed. This was an unconventional approach because normally when a government wants to stimulate the economy in this way, they lower interest rates instead of raising them, so that businesses and individuals can take out more loans to promote economic activity through spending and business operations. The reason why Germany did not do this, however, was because it feared the potential for inflation if the economic shock of absorbing the East damaged production. Germany in the period between the First and Second World Wars suffered terrible hyperinflation that spread poverty throughout the country, and even 60 years later that memory had not been lost. The high interest rates in Germany did exactly what they were designed to do. They attracted investors from around the world who wanted to keep their money in German marks because they could earn a much higher interest rate, including investors from the UK who had a comparatively much lower interest rate. Since the values of these currencies were linked together with the ERM, theoretically there was no risk in having money saved in Germany. The result was that the value of the British pound wanted to go down and the German mark wanted to go up, but the Bank of England was not allowed to let that happen because of the rules of the ERM. The UK ended up selling huge reserves of foreign currencies in an attempt to artificially keep the value of the pound high, and was also forced to start raising interest rates at a time when the UK economy itself was not doing so well and probably would have benefited from a reduction in interest rates. To make matters worse, many investors suspected that even an institution as powerful as the Bank of England could not resist these market forces forever, and that eventually the value of these currencies would snap back to where they wanted to be according to the laws of supply and demand. This meant that they changed even more money into German marks because, if they were right, not only would they earn a higher interest rate while they waited, but they would also profit if the ERM failed and the value of the currencies was allowed to equalize at the levels where it should have been. Obviously, this ultimately did not work out, but not before the Bank of England made increasingly desperate attempts to keep its commitment to keep the foreign exchange rate stable. On the day of the collapse, the bank raised interest rates from 10% to 15% before admitting defeat and lowering them back down to 12%, all within the span of a day. In the short term, the UK suffered, as did the rest of Europe, but it did something much more damaging in the long term for the country. It began to raise doubts about how well managed the UK really was. In the years that followed, the country was one of the economies most affected by the global financial crisis and suffered collateral damage from the Eurozone crisis, went through a very uncertain breakup with the EU, and is now probably best known for its revolving door of prime ministers, although as an Australian I can't really say much about that last point. The problem this has created is that now no one has much certainty about the future of the UK, which means it is risky to make investments or trade deals or really anything with the country because it has not shown the consistency for which it was once famous. Obviously, it goes without saying that the UK is still much more stable than a country like Somalia, but it's all relative. The UK has become very dependent, especially on the financial industry. This has been great for the City of London, where most of these activities take place, but has not done much good for the rest of the country. Unlike a financial center like New York, most of the money flowing into London is not flowing into national companies and projects. It is going instead into opaque financial investments made around the world on behalf of people who choose to do business in the city thanks to its willingness to turn a blind eye rather than the markets it grants access to. London is still the second largest financial center in the world, but the type of finance that takes place there is in many ways doing more harm than good to the rest of the country. The British pound has been in constant and slow decline against other global currencies for practically the last century, but is probably still overvalued relative to where it should be because of its use by London's financial sector. British national industries have also been hurt by this because it has made it more difficult to compete with regional peers in the EU, who have also had the advantage of more favourable trade agreements now that the UK is no longer a member, as well as with other emerging competitors in the world. Furthermore, the UK, which was once a world leader in industrialization, now has outdated infrastructure, declining education, and weak utilization of technology, which is making its workers less productive, less competitive globally, and therefore less well paid. Workers in the UK in highly skilled jobs can earn much more in places like the United States, Canada, Australia, and even in Asian financial centers like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. This is causing a strange situation in which in the UK there are many people who are migrating to the country from less developed economies to find a better life with better opportunities, and at the same time many people who are leaving the country to find an even better life with even better opportunities. The net result of this coming and going is clear, however. The UK is attracting more people than it is losing for now, but it is losing many highly skilled workers and is losing more and more of them every year since 2007. If the trend continues, the UK will end up with a declining population, deprived of all its most productive workers. This overall negative outlook has in turn made the UK an even less desirable place to make investments or start a business or pursue a career. Advanced high-income countries, which the UK still is on average, usually have a last defense against these problems. Their own rich citizens can compensate for the lack of foreign investment and alleviate problems such as national debt. Japan, for example, has the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in the world, But not too many economists are particularly concerned about this because most of the debt is owed at very low interest rates to their own citizens. The UK also has many wealthy residents who can make the necessary investments in the economy, but just like foreign investors, they are choosing to invest their money elsewhere in other countries that have a more predictable future. The gap between outflows and inflows of foreign direct investment is at a historical high in the UK since the Great Financial Crisis. While all of this may seem overly theoretical, it is having very real impacts in the UK as the country struggles with regional poverty from a growing number of people who cannot afford to live in their own country. Unfortunately, if these problems persist, they are likely to feed on each other just as they did in 1992, as increasingly desperate attempts are made to keep the sinking ship afloat. Share your personal experience on today's topic with us. Write it in the comments and ask us any questions you may have. We will be happy to answer. Leave a comment so that we can perfect our creations. We will be happy with your simple like, but the most important thing is not to forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming videos.